that, but I'm going to start by talking about the way that I practice. I'm a doctor, I'm a chiropractor and a nutritionist. I practice functional medicine. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way I practice and why it's different than what you get at a lot of other doctors' offices. Then when I talk about thyroid and metabolism and stuff, my approach will make a lot more sense to you when you understand kind of philosophically where I'm coming from. Okay? So functional medicine differs from what you get at your regular family practice doctor's office, or what I call your prescriptive doctor, okay, the one that writes the prescriptions for you. Their job is different than most people think it is. If I were to compare myself to what you're used to when you go to the doctor, I am not nearly as concerned with arriving at a particular named diagnosis. I am much more concerned with figuring out where there was an error in your metabolism or where there is a glitch in your body's functioning that led to the symptoms that you have. Okay, whether or not we ever really name it doesn't have anything to do with whether we can treat you. Okay, in regular medicine, and this is important for you guys to understand, in your regular doctor's office, there are certain rules about what they can treat and what they can't. If they can't name it, if they can't assign a particular diagnosis to it, they can't get paid for treating it. Right? The insurance company, all the treatments they do have to have a code assigned to them, and that code is your diagnosis. And there can be many of them. But if you don't meet the requirements for a particular diagnosis, then the treatment is not going to be reimbursed by the insurance company. Okay? So they have to arrive at a diagnosis. The other problem is if they don't arrive at a diagnosis, there's no protocol for how to treat you. Once they name it, you open up the book, there's the list of what to do. If it doesn't work, well, you named it wrong, name it again. Pick something different. But that's the way the system is set up. And it's not necessarily their fault. The drug companies have a lot of influence while they're in medical school. The insurance companies have a lot of influence once they're out. And with what they get paid, how much time do they have to spend with you? Right? 5 minutes, maybe 8. And they've got to move on to the next patient. So they are not in the business of figuring out where your problems came from or what really is going wrong. They're in the business of saying, can I name this? And is there a drug I'm familiar with that will make them not notice it? But that's really what it is. So you go in and you ask, why do I feel like this? Well, that's not their job. That's not what they do. So they answer you with, what you have is called this. Well, you didn't go in and say, oh my gosh, this has been bothering me for years. What do I call this? That wasn't your question, but that's their answer. So they say, oh, well, you go in and say, my joints just hurt. And they say, well, you've got arthritis, which means you've got painful joints. I mean, they basically told you exactly what you told them. But now that they've named it, they can give you an anti-inflammatory so you don't feel the pain. But what you were likely looking for was, what is this? Where did it come from? How did it develop? And how can we undo this? How can I get back to where I was before the arthritis? Not just how can I ignore it while it keeps going. What I say to my patients frequently is it's analogous to taking your car into the mechanic and saying it's making this really bad noise in the back end of the car. And so he looks it over and comes back in and gives you earphones and says, now you won't notice it. Well, that's fine. You go out and drive around and it's making the bad noise, but eventually what's going to happen? It's going to get worse. There's yet another symptom. Then you finally go in and say, well, now it just won't drive. Okay, well, now we're going to go replace the transmission. But what if they had figured it out the first time? So functional medicine is much more about the mechanism that led you to have those symptoms. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. The other thing I tell people, another car analogy, because I'm a guy. It's like making a bunch of cars without fuel gauges. Technically, you haven't run out of gas until that car doesn't run anymore. Right? Up until then, you still had gas. It was still running. So why do you care if you're on 1/8 of a tank? You haven't run out of gas. But once you actually run out of gas, then they can diagnose it. Then they can name it. Of course, now they have to call a wrecker. They have to have you towed. They have to put a gallon in it. Then they get you somewhere else, put more, and blah, blah, blah. It's a big to-do. If you had just stopped at a 1/4 tank, It's no big deal. And that's why we have fuel gauges in our car. But our healthcare system works differently. Until you run out of gas, you don't have a gas problem. So understand that. Everything I tell you is based more on looking at your function than looking at whether or not you've technically run out of gas. Make sense? Okay. So that gives you some sense of what functional medicine is. You'll understand it more as we go through the rest of this.